This is a recording from the desk of KUCB radio station. Also, we want to talk about a few subject matters that are real important. KUCB, our motto is we communicate to educate and organize, and truth is the wealth of freedom. This segment, we'll be talking about what's going on in Ferguson, Missouri. And not just to focus on Ferguson, Missouri, but this is something that goes all the way back to the murder and death of Emmett Till in Money, Mississippi in 1955. And so over a period of time, what has happened in this country is that police brutality has been on an increase, and it really has not stopped and ceased since that time and since that period. Now, some people may think that this is not a big deal, or it's not anything that's important, and we'll grant you that. I heard El-Haj Malik El-Shabazz, Malcolm X, say one time in one of his lectures, in one of his interviews, that in the original stage, when the Constitution of the U.S. was written up, that the slaves at that time was not included in the Constitution. So as a result of that, if someone is not included in something that's written up and the country is supposed to be based on that, then those people are kind of just excluded from having any kind of rights, any kind of say-so. And every year they have to ratify the Constitution and that amendment, 1516 amendment, they have to ratify that. And so that's a serious problem. And from that point, that originally happened in the original writing of the Constitution to still to this day, it's still something that you see a lot of the laws and a lot of the rules are based on that. We're talking about injustice. That's what we're talking about. Let us be clear. At the basis of all what we are talking about in this discussion today is injustice. Injustice in the beginning of the writing of the Constitution. Injustice from the point that slaves are not included in the writing of the Constitution. So that was injustice. Injustice to the point that they gave a lot of free labor. They worked and labored from sun up to sundown. But at the same time, they didn't have any rights. So they had the rights to work and build the country, but they didn't have the rights as far as voting, public accommodation, just so many things they didn't have a right to. Now we have access to those things, but still injustice is there. And one of the most interesting things about the injustice and the police officers who murder not only African American people, they murder whites, they murder Hispanics. But it seemed like the last 10 or 20, 30 years, there's been a high rate of African American men of all ages being murdered. And so we call it murder because that's what it is. And so what you see happening today is just still a carryover from what happened in 1950, 1940, 1960, all up until this period that we're in today. It's still the same thing. And one of the things that happened during the Rodney King riots, a loss of the riots in this country. If you go back to the riots that happened in the 1900s, the riots that happened in the 60s, the riots that happened in Rodney King, a lot of those riots stem from police brutality. People talked about the people and ridiculed the people and telling them they was acting a certain way. Well, a lot of the riots started because police officers back in the day, they were murdering and abusing people. When NWA come out with some of its lyrics back in the 50s and the 60s in Compton and South Central, the reason they got so ridiculed because they were talking about police brutality. They were writing about it in their music, in their lyrics. They were talking about it. They was exposing. They was telling people about what was going on in Compton and in South Central. And the FBI had them on a watch list, because of their lyrics and their songs. So there's always been this history of police brutality that's been here in America. So Ferguson, Missouri is nothing new. It's sad about what happened, but this country has a history of injustice. It just didn't start in Ferguson, Missouri. The injustice started in the writing of the Constitution when the slaves at that particular time were not included. They were excluded. So if you write up a piece of a document that's supposed to be an important part of a country, and then you exclude a segment of the population, that means those people have no rights. They don't have any rights at all. And so this is what we see happening. So the injustice started in the writing of the Constitution of the United States, because the injustice was the fact that the slaves at that particular time had no rights. And today, it's in certain areas you see the injustice still going on. For instance, you have so many cities, so many places in the suburbs where you have the towns and cities are made up of all African Americans, and you have the city council, you have the local government there, the police departments, all the city makeup is all white. And so there's an imbalance there. There's not a balance there, there's an imbalance there. Because you may have one or two African Americans on city council, you may have one or two on the police department. And most times, if they don't speak out or they don't say anything, most times they can't do anything. Sometimes what you even see, they might appoint a police chief. Well, that can be done on the basis that he can just be appointed as a kind of someone to keep everybody quiet, but he really can't say and do that much. If he say and do that, call out injustice, then probably what's going to happen to him, he's going to be fired from his position. To give you an example of this, in a small town in Mississippi, I can't remember the name of the town, but they had a situation where they elected the first black sheriff there. And guess what? After a short time, they end up firing him because it was a situation where you had an all-white town, but you had African-American sheriff. And so they didn't like it. They didn't go for it. And so they fired him. He was there for a short time. But so many times, this is what happens in cases like this, when you have situations like this where you have a African-American sheriff over an all-white town. And in so many cases in the history of the U.S., you probably don't have that many cases where you have an African-American sheriff that would be over an all-white town. You won't see it that much. Where if you reverse that, you see so many cases where you have African-American communities, mainly suburban towns, small towns where you have the sheriff is white, the whole police department is white, the whole city council is white. You may have one or two. So you see the imbalance that occurs in these two situations. So once again, we'll talk about injustice. Our whole discussion, our whole subject matter today that we're talking about is that the root of all this is injustice. And they say if there's no justice, there's no peace. That's a theme that we use from back in the day. It's still a cry that's being used today. And so police abuse, police misconduct, police brutality, it's been going on for quite some time. And my point that I was going to mention about what happened in L.A. during the Rodney King riots, they had enough momentum, they had enough protests and outcry that the pressure was put on Tom Bradley when he was the mayor of L.A. at that time. They called for the firing of Daryl Gates. Daryl Gates was the police chief of L.A. for a long time. He was, and so what you see is that these city council members, these police chiefs, they have the thinking, the mentality is just like it was in 1950, 1955, 1945. They have the same thinking of apartheid like it was in South Africa with P.W. Boker and Ian Smith. They have the same type of thinking as Bull Connor, who was the sheriff of Birmingham, Alabama during the 60s. They have the same type of racist thinking and attitude towards people of color as those guys do. Really, there's no difference, you know? So you have this kind of we call it Jim Crow back in the day. Well, there's a new Jim Crow in this year, even though we may have an African American president, but still we have a new Jim Crow law that we see that's really still there, that's been there from back in the 1940s and 50s. That Jim Crow law is still there. So the thinking, my point is the thinking though is just like it was back in the day. A George Wallace, Ian Smith, P.W. Boker in South Africa, or Bull Connor in Birmingham, Alabama. These guys today, the new thinking today, is no different than it was in 1940, 1950. They may have a suit on, they may have a tie on, they may have a three-piece on, they may have a different language, a different lingo, but the thinking and the talking and the rhetoric is still the same. There's still that injustice is at the bottom of all this. We just want to bring you kind of a small discussion, a small talk on injustice from the desk of KUCB Radio